how does a man protect against prostate problems?
Well, let's go back to this. That's the third time I've mentioned this study. In Japan in 1958, autopsy-proven deaths from cancer of the prostate, 18. There's your answer. You eat plant-based starting at a young age, and you're probably not going to have, you're going to have a minimal likelihood of developing prostate cancer, and also it probably is not going to be as likely to grow.
And how do you prevent diabetes?
Well, again, type 1 diabetes, you're probably going to have a tough time preventing. That's some sort of pancreatic injury that we're not yet fully aware of, whether it's due to the products in milk, as has been suggested, which in that situation, there are milk antibodies, which as your body fights it, the milk antibodies are so apparently similar to the beta cell, which produces insulin in our pancreas, that our own bodies are destroying our beta cell production of insulin. Type 2 diabetes, again, most of that is going to be lifestyle. And the way to protect is by eating whole food plant-based nutrition. This is, again, the elegant studies of Neil Barnard showing how you could reverse diabetes. And he uses I think an image that really patients can relate to. That is to say, think of it this way. You have insulin from your pancreas, which normally is going to escort the glucose in your body into the cells to be metabolized. But the insulin to escort the glucose into the cell to be metabolized, the insulin has to turn the key in the lock to escort the glucose in. But if persons who are gained overweight, it's the muscle cells which suddenly are getting fatter and fatter, and that fat in those muscle cells seems to work like glue, and the insulin cannot turn the key with the glue in the lock. So as soon as you can get these patients to get rid of their weight, they metabolize the fat or the glue out of the lock, and once again, the insulin can escort the glucose into the cell, because when it's filled with glue, the insulin can't get it in, and the insulin backs up, and that's what we call insulin resistance.
What about eggs? Are they healthy? What about egg whites?
Yeah, let's just talk about the egg. I think for this, I made a special little effort to be up to speed on this. This is a study that was done by Dr. Zhang and his colleagues, and they looked at some 27,000 people, actually 29,615 people. They were pooled from a number of well-known studies, the atherosclerotic risk in communities, the coronary artery risk development in young adults study, the Framingham Heart Study, the Framingham Offspring Study, the Jackson Heart Study, and the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis. So these are very sophisticated studies. And the researchers discovered that the risk of developing and dying from cardiovascular disease, including heart disease, stroke, and heart failure, were increased in those who regularly consume dietary cholesterol or eggs. For every additional 300 milligrams of dietary cholesterol consumed, the risk of cardiovascular disease increased by 17%, while the risk for mortality increased by 18%. With respect to the consumption of eggs, the scientists found that for every additional half an egg each day, the risk for cardiovascular disease was up 6% and mortality by 8%. Yeah, so it's really, again, it's animal protein and cholesterol, not a good thing.
So then what's wrong with eating fish? Everyone says it's healthy.
Well, if you want a steady diet of mercury, dioxin, and PCBs, you got fish. What are they? There is no such thing as an organic fish, farmed or in the ocean. There's so much contamination. And really, the way they harvest fish is almost evil, because you're bulldozing the ocean. And the ones that you've killed and you don't want, you just throw them back. I mean, it's just terrible. And what does it do when you eat them? Ansel Keys did autopsy studies of the Eskimos who were eating fish. They're loaded with atherosclerosis. Yeah.
What do you recommend for someone who has gastrointestinal disease?
Well, that can be pretty involved and extensive. Because remember, the gastrointestinal tract starts at the mouth and goes all the way to the bottom where the sun doesn't shine. And let's say you start with GERD, gastrointestinal reflux disease, right? Where you have gastric acid refluxes up, and the acid will burn the lower part of your esophagus, which has a lining that was never that was never designed to be bathed with gastric acid. Now, most patients are given a bunch of antacids for this, and then that commits them to almost a lifetime of something that has often side effects. And I've just said earlier how antacids will reduce the gastric acidity, and if you're trying to make extra nitric oxide from chewing the green leafy vegetables, you'll not be able to do it because of the antacid. However, rarely during the day when somebody is sitting or when they're standing, they're not going to have much in the way of any reflux, because obviously gastric acid is a liquid and it's not going to flow uphill. So when these patients really burn their esophagus and injure it is when they're lying down at night. They're lying in bed flat, and if you have an incompetent esophageal sphincter, then the gastric acid will just roll up into your esophagus and create its damage at that time. So what we've always done, which seemed to be effective, is if you get the patients to elevate the head of the bed on 6-inch blocks. Never try pillows. They don't work. Elevate the head of the bed on 6-inch blocks so you're sleeping on a slant. Other gastrointestinal disease, while we're at the stomach, we talked about peptic ulcer disease, which actually nowadays you don't have to have surgery for that, but by taking antibiotics you can kill the Helicobacter pylori. That's the case. Obviously, if you have gastric cancer, well, that should be excised surgically. When you get down to the small bowel, you may have things like Crohn's disease, or even in the large intestine and the small intestine can have ulcerative colitis. What seems to be very beneficial there is actually whole food plant-based nutrition, interestingly enough. And you want to do everything you can to protect that tiny layer that exists on the colon that protects the colon from the endotoxin that are being produced by the bacteria that are in our intestine. Diverticulitis is an interesting one, simply again because of the relatively slow transit time and tendency to sluggish bowel movements with the Western diet. When pressures get so high on the colon, there is extravasation of the mucosa right up alongside where the blood vessels normally go. And sometimes when a bit of fecal material becomes inspissated in that extravasated mucosa, it gets inflamed, and now you have a diverticula, which now is diverticulitis. And when those those usually can quiet down with an episode of antibiotics, but then be sure the patients do have plant-based nutrition so there's less higher pressure and less likely to have that recur. Obviously, appendicitis is a common entity, and although it's usually been removed with surgery, they are now carefully looking at whether sometimes that can be managed with antibiotics. Still in the gastrointestinal tract, usually this is in infants and children, a thing called Hershbrong's disease. And that's an inherited abnormality where the muscle fiber of the colon lacks the nerve that is going to make a transit. And those patients actually can be helped when the segment of the colon that lacks these nerve endings is removed. The constipation obviously can be resolved with, again, plant-based nutrition. And I think the same thing can be said for irritable bowel disease. And the thing that comes echoing through in all these GI situations, except maybe Hershbrong's, that inherited one, is the benefit of fiber. You just cannot get enough fiber. Yeah. And what was the rest of that question?
But, really just that was it. What would you recommend for people who have gastrointestinal disease?
Yeah, I just start from the top and go to the bottom, and those are the answers.